The scent of pine and earth filled the crisp afternoon air as Danny ran through the clearing, his laughter echoing between the towering trees. The campsite was only a short distance behind him, where his parents were setting up their tent, but for now, he was lost in his own world. A flash of color caught his eye. A butterfly, its bright orange wings fluttering like tiny flames against the green backdrop of the forest. Without thinking, Danny chased after it. The butterfly danced just out of reach, flitting between branches, gliding over the uneven forest floor. Danny giggled as he ran, weaving through trees, stepping over fallen logs. He didn't notice how far he had gone, until suddenly, it was gone. Danny came to a stop, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He spun in a slow circle, expecting to see the flicker of a campfire or hear the faint sound of his parents' voices. But there was nothing. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their towering forms casting long shadows as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky. The laughter that had once filled Danny's chest faded, replaced by a cold, creeping sense of unease. His stomach twisted. He turned sharply and started walking back the way he thought he had come, but the forest all looked the same. The trees, the bushes, the fallen leaves, everything blended together in an endless sea of green and brown. A lump formed in his throat. "Mom? Dad?" he called out. Silence. Danny's small hands curled into fists. "Mom!" he shouted louder. "Dad?" Only the rustling of leaves answered him, the wind whispering through the trees like a quiet, eerie voice. Danny's breath hitched. He spun in a frantic circle, trying to remember which way he had come, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Panic surged through his small body. He ran. Branches scratched at his arms as he pushed through thick undergrowth. The light filtering through the trees began to fade, the sky turning shades of deep blue and gray. His feet stumbled over roots and uneven ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, a misstep. Danny tripped over an exposed tree root and fell hard onto the damp earth. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain through his hands and knees. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He couldn't cry. He had to find his way back. Sniffling, he pushed himself up, his legs shaking beneath him. And then, just as he was about to take another step, a sound. Faint, weak, a low, painful whimper. Danny froze. He held his breath, listening. Another whimper. This time a little louder. It was coming from somewhere nearby. Slowly, cautiously, Danny followed the sound, stepping carefully over fallen branches and damp leaves. As he approached a small clearing, his breath caught in his throat. There, tangled in a barbed wire fence, was a large German shepherd. Its fur, once thick and golden, was now dirty and matted. Blood stained its coat where the sharp metal had dug into its skin. Its body trembled with exhaustion, its chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The dog lifted its head weakly, its dark eyes meeting Danny's. Danny's heart pounded. He should have been scared, but all he saw in the dog's eyes was pain and a silent plea for help. Danny's breath came in shaky gasps as he stared at the injured dog. The sight of blood made his stomach twist, and for a fleeting second fear crept up his spine. What if the dog was dangerous? What if it bit him? But then Rex whimpered again, his body shivering with pain. Danny hesitated, then took a slow step forward. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I won't hurt you." The German shepherd tensed, his muscles tightening despite his weakened state. He tried to move, but the barbed wire dug deeper into his flesh, making him let out a pained yelp. Danny winced. He could see where the sharp metal had sliced into the dog's legs and side, fur stained dark with dried blood. Every time the dog struggled, the barbs only dug in deeper. Danny's throat tightened. He had to help. Frantically, he looked around for something, anything, that could loosen the wire. His gaze landed on a broken tree branch a few feet away. That could work. He hurried over and picked it up, its rough bark scratching against his palms. Turning back to the trapped dog, he held the stick out like a shield, using it to try and push the wire away from the dog's body. But as soon as he got closer, Rex let out a low, warning growl. Denny froze. The sound wasn't loud or aggressive. It was weak, uncertain. The dog's dark eyes locked onto his, filled with exhaustion, pain, and something else. Distrust. Denny swallowed hard, his small hands gripping the stick tightly, his heart pounded. I'm not trying to hurt you," he said, his voice shaking. "I just want to help." Rex's ears flicked, but his body remained tense. Danny felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had never felt so helpless before. He didn't know how to free the dog without scaring it even more. He sniffled, blinking hard. "I won't hurt you," he whispered. His voice was thick, full of emotion. "I just want to help." For a long, silent moment, the two simply stared at each other. Then, Rex's growl faded. His body slackened slightly, his ears lowering as if in reluctant surrender. Danny's breath caught. The dog wasn't fighting him anymore. He trusted him. Swallowing back his nerves, Danny carefully stepped closer, inching toward the tangled wire. And this time, Rex didn't growl. He let him come closer. Danny took a deep breath, his small hands trembling as he reached for the tangled barbed wire. Up close, the twisted metal looked even sharper, rusted in places and stained with dried blood. He hesitated. What if he made it worse? What if Rex got scared and bit him? But then, Rex let out a weak whimper, his golden eyes filled with pain. Danny clenched his jaw. He had to do this. Carefully, he wrapped his fingers around the wire and tugged. Pain shot through his palm as the sharp edges bit into his skin. He gasped, quickly pulling his hand back. A thin line of blood welled up on his fingers. It hurt, but looking at Rex, he knew the dog's pain was far worse. Danny wiped his bleeding hand against his shorts, ignoring the sting, and tried again. This time, he grabbed a section of the wire near Rex's paw and pulled with all his strength. The metal barely budged. Rex let out a low whine, his body shuddering. Danny's heart pounded. He couldn't give up. Bracing his feet against the ground, he grabbed a thicker part of the wire and yanked with every ounce of strength he had. The wire shifted, just a little. Encouraged, he tried again. His arms ached, his hands burned, but he didn't stop. He gritted his teeth, pulling as hard as he could. And then, snap! The wire loosened. Rex let out a sharp yelp as his leg finally came free. His body slumped forward, his breathing ragged. Danny stumbled back, his own chest rising and falling in quick gasps. His arms ached, his hands were raw, but he didn't care. Rex was free. Tears filled Danny's eyes as he dropped to his knees beside the injured dog. "You're okay," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You're free now." He reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers over Rex's dirt-matted fur. For the first time, Rex didn't flinch, didn't growl. He simply rested his head against Danny's leg, exhausted but safe. Danny sniffled, his vision blurring as he wrapped his small arms around the dog's massive body. Tears rolled down his cheeks, falling into Rex's fur. But they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relief, of victory. But as Danny looked down at Rex's trembling form, he realized something else. Rex was hurt, too hurt to walk, and they were still lost. Danny wiped his face and sat up straighter. If they wanted to survive, he had to take care of Rex, just like Rex would take care of him. Danny wiped his tear-streaked face with the back of his sleeve, his breath still shaky from the effort of freeing Rex. His hands were sore, his body exhausted, but he knew they couldn't stay here. They were still lost, and Rex was still hurt. Danny looked down at the dog's bleeding leg, watching the way he trembled with every shallow breath. He needed help. They both did. Danny took a deep breath and shrugged off his jacket. He didn't have much, but he had to do something. "This might hurt a little," he whispered as he tore a strip from his t-shirt and carefully wrapped it around Rex's wound. His hands were clumsy, and the fabric quickly stained red, but at least it would slow the bleeding. Rex let out a quiet whimper, but didn't pull away. Danny sat back on his heels, scanning the trees around them. "If we can find a road," he said, mostly to himself, "someone will help us." Rex blinked, his ears flicking slightly. Danny chewed on his lip. "Maybe, just maybe, Rex knew the way out. Can you take us home?" he asked hesitantly. Rex didn't move at first. Then, slowly, the dog pushed himself up onto shaky legs. Danny's heart swelled with hope. He stood up and carefully placed his hand on Rex's back. "Okay," he said softly, "let's go." The forest felt bigger in the dark. Shadows stretched between the towering trees, and the air had turned cold. Danny shivered but kept moving, his hand resting on Rex for comfort. They walked slowly, Rex limping with every step, Danny carefully watching where he placed his feet. The night was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. After what felt like hours, Danny's legs ached. His stomach growled in protest, and his body begged for rest. Then, Rex stopped. Danny blinked up at him. "What is it?" Rex's ears perked, his nose twitching. A second later, Danny heard it too. The sound of something moving. Danny's breath hitched. At first he thought maybe it was just the wind rustling the underbrush. But then, a pair of glowing eyes appeared between the trees. Danny's blood ran cold. A wolf. It was thin, its ribs visible beneath a coat of shaggy fur, and its yellow eyes locked onto Danny with a hunger that made his stomach twist in fear. Danny took a slow step backward, his hands trembling. The wolf stepped forward. Danny's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Then, a low, menacing growl. "Rex." The dog stepped in front of Danny, his body tense, his lips curled back to reveal sharp teeth, his ears flattened, and a deep, threatening snarl rumbled from his chest. Danny clutched the back of Rex's fur, fear gripping him like ice. "Rex," he whispered. The wolf took another step closer, its muscles coiling like a spring. Then, it lunged. Rex moved in an instant. The two animals collided with a force that sent leaves and dirt flying. Snarls and barks filled the night air as they tumbled together, claws raking, teeth snapping. Danny screamed as the wolf sank its teeth into Rex's shoulder. "No!" But Rex didn't back down. Even injured, he fought with everything he had. With a powerful twist, he shoved the wolf off him and sank his teeth into its scruff. The wolf let out a yelp, kicking wildly before finally ripping itself free. It stumbled back, panting heavily. For a tense second, it stood there, ears pinned, teeth bared. Then, it turned and vanished into the darkness. Silence. Danny barely registered the moment before he collapsed to his knees beside Rex. The dog swayed unsteadily, his breaths ragged. Danny reached out with shaking hands, touching Rex's fur, feeling the fresh warmth of blood beneath his fingers. Tears welled in his eyes. "You saved me," he whispered, voice cracking. Rex let out a low, exhausted huff, then pressed his head against Danny's chest. Danny choked on a sob and threw his arms around the dog's thick neck. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice shaking. But as he pulled away, he saw the blood seeping into the dirt beneath Rex. Danny swallowed back the lump in his throat. They had to keep moving. If they didn't find help soon, it might be too late. The first light of dawn crept through the trees, casting golden streaks across the forest floor. Danny blinked awake, his body stiff from the cold night. His fingers ached, his stomach felt empty, but none of that mattered, because Rex was still breathing. The German Shepherd lay beside him, his fur damp with morning dew, his body unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Danny sat up, carefully touching Rex's injured shoulder. The wound from the wolf's attack was still raw, dried blood clinging to his fur. Danny's throat tightened. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, gently rubbing Rex's head. "We have to keep going." For a moment he thought Rex wouldn't move. Then Rex's nose twitched, his ears flicked. Then, with a low grunt, he pushed himself up onto shaky legs. Danny's heart leaped. Rex lifted his head slightly, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the crisp morning air. Then he turned. His ears perked, his posture straightened, and despite his pain, he took a determined step forward. Danny frowned. "What is it?" Rex sniffed again, then looked back at Danny, as if telling him to follow. Danny's pulse quickened. "You know the way, don't you?" Rex didn't wait. With slow, limping steps, he led the way, his body weak but his determination unshaken. Danny scrambled to his feet, ignoring the ache in his legs, and hurried after him. The forest stretched endlessly around them as they walked. Danny had no idea how long they had been moving. Time felt strange out here. His stomach growled, his feet dragged. But every time he thought about stopping, Rex kept moving forward. And so Danny did too. Branches snapped beneath their steps. The sun rose higher, the air warmed slightly, but exhaustion weighed on them both. Danny's legs ached, his eyes burned from lack of sleep. At one point he stumbled, barely catching himself. I don't know if I can go much farther," he panted, clutching his side. Rex stopped and looked back at him, his amber eyes steady. Then he nudged Danny's hand with his nose, a silent reassurance. Danny swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's keep going." They had been walking for what felt like hours when Rex suddenly froze. His ears stood straight. His nose twitched rapidly. Danny's heart pounded. "What is it?" Then a sound, faint but unmistakable, a voice. "Danny! Danny, can you hear us?" Danny's breath caught. He turned wildly, eyes wide. Another voice, louder this time. "Danny, if you can hear us, call out." Danny's chest tightened with hope. His throat burned as he inhaled sharply. "I'm here," he screamed. "I'm here." For a second, there was silence. Then, voices shouting his name, footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Danny's legs almost gave out as relief flooded through him. He turned to Rex, his eyes brimming with tears. "We did it," he choked out. "Rex, we—" But Rex wasn't looking at him anymore. Danny's stomach dropped. Rex swayed on his feet. His body trembled, and then he collapsed. Danny screamed. "Rex!" He fell to his knees beside the dog, shaking him desperately. "No, no, no, wake up! You can't stop now! We're safe!" Rex's eyes fluttered open just slightly. His breathing was shallow. His body was still. Tears streamed down Danny's face. "Somebody help!" he sobbed, looking up desperately as voices grew closer. Then, a man in an orange rescue vest burst through the trees. Danny barely had time to process what was happening before strong arms lifted him off the ground. "It's okay, kiddo. We've got you," the man said. Danny's arms lashed out. "No!" he screamed. "Rex! You have to save Rex." The rescuers exchanged glances. Then one of them knelt beside the dog. "He's alive," the woman said quickly. "But he's weak. We need to get them both out, now." Danny sobbed with relief as he was carried out of the forest. But as they made their way to safety, his eyes never left Rex. He wouldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything. Danny's eyelids fluttered open, the bright white ceiling above him making him squint. The steady beeping of a heart monitor filled the quiet hospital room, and for a moment he felt disoriented. Then a gasp. Danny! His mother's arms wrapped around him before he could even sit up. Her body shook with quiet sobs, her warmth surrounding him. His father's voice was thick with emotion. "Oh, buddy, you're safe." Danny let them hold him, but his mind was racing. The memories came flooding back. The forest, the cold, the hunger. Rex. He shot upright. "Where's Rex?" His parents exchanged a glance, and his mother gently placed her hands on his shoulders. "Sweetheart, calm down." Danny shook his head furiously. "No. Where is he? Is he okay? He saved me." A new voice answered. "He's alive." Danny turned toward the doorway where a man in a veterinary coat stood. "He's a fighter," the vet continued with a smile. "It was touch and go for a while, but he made it through surgery. He's resting now." Danny collapsed back against the pillows, exhaling shakily. His vision blurred as relief swept through him. He covered his face with his hands. "Thank you," he whispered. But then a new fear took hold. "Wait, what's going to happen to him now?" he asked, lowering his hands. "Does he have an owner?" The vet hesitated, glancing at his parents. Danny's heart pounded. "I want to keep him," he blurted. "Please, he saved my life. I have to save his." His parents hesitated. "Danny, a dog is a big responsibility," his father said gently. "And Rex has been through a lot. He'll need time to heal." Danny's throat tightened. "I don't care," he said fiercely. "We need each other. We saved each other." A long pause. Then his mother smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "Then he's already family." Danny's eyes widened. You mean, his father chuckled. "It looks like we have a new member of the family." Danny let out a choked laugh, tears spilling down his cheeks. Rex was his. They would never be apart. A month later, the sun was warm against Danny's skin as he stepped outside, stretching his arms. His legs no longer ached, his cuts had healed, and everything felt normal again. But something was missing. Then, a sound. A bark. Danny's heart leaped. He spun around just in time to see a familiar shape bounding toward him. Rex, the German shepherd, his coat sleek and clean, his wounds healed, ran straight into Danny's arms. Danny buried his face in Rex's thick fur, his laughter bubbling over with pure joy. "We did it," he whispered. "We really made it." Rex let out a happy bark, his tail wagging furiously. Then, just like that first night in the forest, he nudged Danny's hand with his nose, a silent promise. "I will always protect you." Danny grinned and took off running across the yard, Rex right beside him. The boy who had once been lost, the dog who had once been broken, two souls that had found each other. And now they were home. Sometimes miracles happen in the most unexpected ways. A lost boy, an injured dog, and a friendship that would last a lifetime. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the most incredible friendships are born in the unlikeliest of places. Danny and Rex found each other when they needed it most. A lost boy and an injured dog, both searching for a way home. And in the end, they didn't just survive, they found family. Who knows? Maybe there's a stray out there waiting for someone like you to notice them. If you love heartwarming rescue stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories for more incredible tales of love, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their furry companions. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.
It was the kind of morning that makes you wonder why anyone chooses to live this far north frost, clinging to every fence post, the world so quiet you could hear snowflakes landing on the hood of your truck. Out here on the edge of Montana's wild country, most days are predictable coffee chores, maybe a glimpse of a deer slipping through the cottonwoods. But not today. Today began with a sound no one forgets. Sharp, desperate, and out of place, carried across the frozen Yellowstone River. It wasn't the cry of a gull or the splash of a fish. It was something raw, almost human in its urgency. And it pulled one man from the warmth of his kitchen into a moment that would test every ounce of his courage. By the time it was over, he wouldn't just have saved a drowning bobcat in a freezing river. He would uncover a connection so personal, so unexpected, that it would change his life forever. What happened out there wasn't luck. It wasn't a coincidence. And if you've ever believed that sometimes the wild chooses us for reasons we can't yet understand, you're going to want to hear this story. Henry Collins had been up since before daylight, as he was most mornings in Paradise Valley. The coffee pot had just finished gurgling when the old wall clock in the kitchen struck 6, its slow chimes echoing through the small drafty cabin. He didn't rush anymore. At 66, moving slowly was part choice, part necessity. He checked the wood stove pulled on his boots and glanced out the window toward the cottonwoods by the Yellowstone River. A thin mist hovered above the ice-edged current. Mornings like this, you could almost forget the world was bigger than these frozen hills. Almost. He reached for his coat, the one patched at both elbows, and opened the door to fetch in some wood. That's when he heard it. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the distant crack of ice shifting downstream. This was sharper, urgent, alive, a sound that sliced through the cold air and made the hair on his neck stand up. It came again, carried on the wind from the riverbank, high-pitched at first, then dropping into a raw, guttural note. He froze in the doorway. In all his years as a park ranger, Henry had heard enough animal calls to know this wasn't casual noise. It was distress, real distress. Something was fighting for its life out there. He stepped down from the porch without thinking. The old injuries in his knees were complaining, but he barely noticed. The sound came again, this time followed by a splash. That's when he felt it, that shift inside your chest when instinct takes over and all the clutter in your head goes quiet. Out here in the wild, hesitation can mean the difference between life and death for both people and animals. He started toward the river, moving faster than he had in months, boots punching into the snow with a crunch that echoed in the stillness. He didn't know what he'd find. Bobcats weren't known for hanging around open water, especially not in January. But the voice in his gut was clear. Whatever was out there couldn't wait. It reminded him of a story he'd heard years back from a fellow ranger in Idaho. The man had been walking a trail when he heard a similar cry. He ended up saving a golden eagle that had been caught in a wire fence. He'd said later that the sound had worked its way under his skin and there was no thinking about it. You either answer the call or you live with the knowledge that you didn't. That stuck with Henry. Nature has a way of teaching you that some moments are invitations. You can walk past them and stay safe, or you can step in and see what's waiting on the other side. As he neared the slope leading down to the river, the cold grew sharper, biting at the skin on his face. He could see patches of thin ice breaking apart in the current. Somewhere in that mess was the source of the cry. His breath came faster, but not just from the climb. There was something else, a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Urgency, yes, but also connection. The sound out there didn't feel like just any wild animal. It felt personal, and that was dangerous because personally made you take risks you shouldn't. Still, he kept going. He thought about the times he'd ignored his gut in the past moments that later turned into regrets. Like the day his son Nathan called from his base overseas and Henry let it go to voicemail, figuring he'd call back later. That call never came again. He couldn't change that. But maybe he could answer this one. The closer he got to the river, the more his mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a deer that had fallen through the ice. Maybe a neighbor's dog. Or, and this thought felt almost absurd, maybe it was a bobcat. He'd only seen a few in his lifetime, all of them cautious, elusive, gone, before you could get more than a glimpse. They were solitary, proud creatures built for survival. If one of them was calling out, it had to be serious. There's a lesson in that, he thought. Even the fiercest among us will cry out when the fight gets too big to handle alone. People forget that. They think asking for help makes you weak. Henry knew better. The snow was deeper now, swallowing his boots to the ankle. He paused at the top of the last rise before the riverbank and listened. The cry came again, weaker this time, but still sharp enough to cut through the wind. His heart kicked harder in his chest. For a second, the world seemed to narrow to just that sound and the cold air burning his lungs. It occurred to him that no one knew he was out here. No one was coming if he slipped on the ice or if the current caught him. But the thought didn't slow him down. A fresh perspective had taken hold, the kind that comes when you stop weighing pros and cons and just decide what kind of person you want to be. He remembered something his friend Laura Bennett, the wildlife biologist, once said after a particularly brutal rescue. We don't choose the moments that define us. They choose us. And they don't always come when it's convenient. He smiled at the memory, though his jaw was stiff from the cold. She was right. This was one of those moments. Somewhere ahead through the trees he saw movement, just a flicker against the white. The sound came again, ragged now. Whatever it was losing strength. He picked up his pace. The ground here was uneven, pocked with old burrows and hidden roots. Twice he stumbled, catching himself with his gloved hands before tumbling forward. He could hear the river now, the steady rush of water, forcing its way around ice floes. In between, the cry, fainter with each call. Real-life rescues are never like the nature videos you see online. There's no background music, no perfect camera angle. Just you, your pounding heart, and the reality that the clock is ticking. He thought about that ranger in Idaho again, about how a choice made in seconds can echo for years. And he thought about Nathan, how proud his son had been of the rescues they'd done together, both human and animal. Henry felt that same pride stir, now mixed with something else. Determination. The kind that makes you forget the cold, forget your age, forget everything except the fact that you've got one job. Don't let this be the day something dies because you move too slow. He reached the edge of the trees and stopped. Below him, the river ran black between jagged shelves of ice. He couldn't see the animal yet, but he could hear it just downstream. He knew better than to rush in blind. First find the safest entry point, then plan your approach. That was training talking, years of it. But the sound, now barely more than a strained rasp, made the planning feel like luxury he couldn't afford. A small lesson settled in his mind. Sometimes the plan has to be built while you're moving because standing still will cost more than acting imperfectly. That thought carried him forward. Down the slope, careful where he put his weight. The snow here had crusted over, making each step a gamble between solid footing and a sudden drop through to loose powder. When he reached the narrow shelf of frozen earth at the river's edge, he finally saw it. A flash of tawny fur, the ripple of muscle under a pelt slick with icy water. He caught just enough of the animal's profile to know this wasn't a deer or a dog. This was a wild cat. And not just any wild cat. A bobcat. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the weight of what that meant. The Yellowstone doesn't hand out encounters like this without reason. In all his years, Henry had learned that when the wild puts something in your path, you pay attention. You respect it. And if you're lucky, you learn from it. He didn't know yet what lesson this moment would hold. But he was about to find out. The cat thrashed once, sending a spray of water into the air, then went still for a moment as if listening. Henry felt that stillness in his bones. It was a pause before a choice, the animal's and his. He looked at the black water between them, at the jagged ice, at the fragile line between survival and loss. Then he stepped closer to the edge. The next move would decide everything. It would take him straight into a story that began long before this winter morning. A story that started with another life. Another promise and a connection neither man nor animal could have planned. Transition. Before the freezing water closed over that bobcat's head, before Henry's boots hit the ice, his path here had already been written, shaped by years of loss, moments of grace, and a single bond that refused to die. To understand why this cry from the river mattered so much, you need to know the man who heard it. Henry Collins had always been a man who measured his life by the work of his hands. For 35 years, he patrolled trails, cleared storm-felled trees, and guided visitors through Montana's wild spaces. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave him something he valued more than money: purpose. When you wake up every day, knowing exactly where you're needed, it's easy to believe that rhythm will never end. That belief ended for Henry in the space of a single year. First came the phone call from the hospital in Bozeman. His wife, Claire, had collapsed in the grocery store. By the time he reached her bedside, the beeping machines were already slowing. A stroke, they said. Quick, merciless, the kind you can't prepare for. He buried her on a cold April morning, standing alone under a sky the color of slate, watching the wind flatten the grass over the fresh dirt. His son Nathan had flown in from his army base in Texas, the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder in the quiet. Nathan was a canine handler, working with military dogs in dangerous places Henry only knew from the news. They'd promised each other they'd make more time, talk more often. 2 months later, Nathan shipped out to Afghanistan. 6 months after that, Henry opened his front door to see a uniformed chaplain standing on the porch. No one needs to be told what that means. The words still echoed in his mind. Your son, killed in action. Roadside device. Henry nodded because nodding was easier than collapsing. After the funeral flag folded, taps played, hands shaken, the people went back to their lives. Henry went back to a house that now seemed too big, too quiet. Days began to blend together. He still rose at dawn, but the mornings stretched empty. Coffee alone, no one at the table, chores done in silence. He had Nathan's old room just as it was, boots lined up, a book stacked by the bed, a framed photo of him with a shepherd dog named Ranger. He'd open the door some nights just to stand there, hand on the frame, remembering the sound of his boy's laugh. Bills began to pile up on the kitchen counter. Hospital costs, property taxes, repairs for the roof that had started leaking in the spring. On a retired ranger's pension, there was no margin. He sold off his old hunting rifles, the aluminum boat he'd restored with Nathan, anything to keep the bank from sending another foreclosure notice. The weight wasn't just financial. Without someone to protect, Henry felt adrift. It's something a lot of retirees don't talk about. When the job and the family both fade, the days lose their edges. That's when the darkness can creep in. A friend from the Ranger Service, Tom Reynolds, had gone through it a few years back after losing his wife. Tom had told Henry, "The hardest part isn't the empty chair. It's realizing no one depends on you anymore." Henry understood that now. It's a truth people rarely admit. Purpose is as necessary as oxygen. Lose it and everything else gets heavier. He'd tried to keep busy volunteering at the local library, fixing fences for neighbors, but nothing stuck. Even the land felt different. The trails he once knew like his own hands seemed longer, steeper. The river sounded louder at night, as if it was carrying away pieces of his life. Through it all, one memory kept circling back, the last long conversation he'd had with Nathan before deployment. They'd been sitting by the wood stove, the younger man rubbing his dog Ranger's ears, talking about the work they wanted to do when Nathan came home. Nathan had been excited about a program pairing veterans with trained animals, not just dogs, but wildlife that had been rescued and rehabilitated. "Dad," he'd said, "you know how you've spent your life helping people respect the wild. This is the same thing, just in reverse. We let the wild help people." Henry had laughed at the idea of a bobcat or a fox helping a soldier with PTSD. Nathan hadn't laughed. One day he'd said, "You'll see what I mean." They never got to finish that plan. But the words stayed with Henry, tucked away like a seed waiting for spring. And that's where the mystery began to take root. Because every so often something would happen, a hawk landing on the fence, a deer stepping into the yard and holding his gaze, that would make Henry feel like the world was leaning toward him, nudging him towards something he couldn't yet name. It's easy to dismiss moments like that when life is full. But when the noise is gone, you start to notice patterns. You start to wonder if the line between coincidence and calling is thinner than you thought. The loneliness wasn't constant. It came in waves. Some days he could manage it, make a list to get things done, even share a joke with the clerk at the feed store. Other days it sat heavy on his chest from the moment he opened his eyes. Those were the days when he'd take long walks along the river, listening to the water, telling himself that one day he'd feel connected again. Real-life examples of that kind of grief are everywhere, though most folks keep it behind closed doors. Veterans, parents, widows, even young people who've lost a sibling, they all share a certain look in their eyes, a mix of sadness and searching. Henry saw that look in himself every time he caught his reflection in the window. A small lesson took shape in him during those years. Healing doesn't come from filling your time. It comes from finding a reason to care again. And caring often starts with answering someone else's need. He didn't know yet whose need that would be, but deep down he hoped it would find him before the clock ran out. As winter settled in that year, the valley grew quieter. Snow covered the fences, the trails disappeared under drifts, and the river steamed in the early mornings. Henry kept a fire going, not so much for the heat, but because it gave him something to tend. Every night, he'd stir the coals. Watch the sparks rise and think about the promise he'd made to Nathan without ever speaking it aloud. That if a chance ever came to finish what his son had started, he wouldn't walk away. He had no idea that promise was about to be called in. Not with a letter or a phone call, but with a sound on the wind that would pull him from his cabin and straight into a test of everything he had left to give. Transition. And so on. That freezing January morning when the cry rose from the Yellowstone River, Henry didn't just hear an animal in trouble. He heard the echo of his own unfinished promise, and he started walking toward it. Henry reached the riverbank, knees stiff from the cold and the climb down. The sound was clearer now, a sharp, ragged cry followed by frantic splashing. He spotted the bobcat about 20 yards downstream, front paws flailing at the ice shelf, while the current dragged its hindquarters under. A length of old fishing line wound tight around one leg, trailing a lead sinker that bobbed like a cruel anchor. He scanned the bank for a safe path. The snow-covered rocks were slick, and the ice close to shore looked fragile. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a rescue in dangerous water. Years back, as a ranger, he'd pulled a teenage kayaker from a spring flood in the Gallatin River. That boy had been wearing a life vest. This bobcat had nothing. The first step was to test the ice. He crouched, sliding his weight forward, listening for the telltale cracks. Each shift sounded like a gunshot in the still air. He kept his eyes on the animal, noting the jerky movements, the way its ears pinned back in panic. Time wasn't on his side. Cold water kills fast, and small bodies lose heat even faster. He called out low and steady, not expecting the bobcat to understand, but knowing tone mattered. "Easy. I'm coming." The cat's head snapped toward him, eyes wide and wild, but it didn't try to bolt. That was its own kind of permission. Moving onto the ice, he felt it flex under his boots. 10 feet out, the water surged up through a crack, soaking his pant leg in an instant. The shock bit deep, but he kept going. His hands reached the fishing line, taut and cutting into the animal's wet fur. The bobcat hissed weakly, but its claws didn't find him. Maybe it knew he was the only chance left. He fumbled with the knot, numb fingers clumsy in the cold. A real-life example flashed in his mind, a fellow ranger, Lyle, who'd once saved a stranded elk calf by cutting it free from barbed wire. Lyle had told him afterward, "You never think about your hands until you can't feel them, and then they're all that matters." Henry understood that now. Finally, the last loop gave way. The sinker slid free, and the bobcat's body sagged against him. Too still. He hooked his arm under its chest and turned back toward the shore, pushing forward in a crouch to distribute his weight. Each step sent jolts of pain up his legs, the cold gnawing at his bones. The bank felt miles away. He counted his breaths to keep focus in, out, willing his grip to hold. At the last stretch, the ice gave way under one boot, plunging his leg to the knee. He lurched forward, dragging the animal clear onto the snow. They both collapsed, steam rising from their bodies. The cat didn't move. Henry laid it on its side and pressed his hands to its rib cage, short, firm pumps like he'd learned in a wildlife first aid course years ago. Between compressions, he rubbed the fur to push warmth back into the skin. "Come on, kid. Not today." A shudder passed through the bobcat. Water dribbled from its mouth, followed by a weak cough. It blinked once, twice, then fixed its gaze on him, an unblinking amber stare that felt far too knowing. Henry sat back, lungs burning. A small lesson settled in his mind. Saving a life isn't about grand gestures. It's about refusing to stop when every part of you says you've done enough. That's the difference between almost and actually. The bobcat staggered to its feet, testing its weight, and looked toward the tree line. Henry half expected it to vanish into the woods. Instead, it took a step toward him, paused, then settled onto the snow beside his leg. He didn't reach to touch it. Some distances are best respected, but he let the moment sit. He thought of Nathan again. His son had always said animals remember the ones who show up. Maybe this cat would. Or maybe it was already filing this moment into some place neither of them could name. From up the bank, Henry heard snow crunching. Dr. Laura Bennett's voice called his name. She'd been checking on a beaver dam nearby when she saw him on the ice. She knelt beside him, eyes moving from Henry's soaked clothes to the bobcat at his side. "You two have met," she said softly. Her gaze dropped to the cat's leg, to the faint imprint where the fishing line had bitten in. "We'll need to check for deep cuts," she said, already pulling a small kit from her bag. As she worked, Henry watched the bobcat's eyes follow her movements, then return to him as if confirming he was still there. A fresh perspective formed in his mind. Rescues don't end when you get someone or something to shore. They begin there. Because what you save doesn't just walk away. It leaves a mark, one you carry forward. When Laura finished, she glanced at the brass plate on the collar. Her brow furrowed. "Henry, this isn't just any bobcat." She looked up at him, the wind lifting strands of her hair. "I think we need to talk about where this one came from." Henry didn't answer right away. The cat shifted the faintest flick of its tail and the mystery deepened. He had a feeling this wasn't the end of a rescue. It was the start of a story that reached back further than either of them knew. That was when the collar's engraved name caught the light, and Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river. It was a name he'd heard before from his son. And that's when he realized this rescue wasn't an accident at all. Laura's hand hovered over the brass plate for a moment before she brushed away the ice crust. The letters came into focus: Echo, property of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Rehabilitation Unit. Henry read them twice, his breath slowing as if the name itself had weight. He'd heard that name before. Not from any ranger reports, not from local sightings. From Nathan. One evening, months before deployment, Nathan had told him about a bobcat that used to linger outside the wire on his base. The soldiers had nicknamed it Echo because it always showed up after a firefight, sitting silently at the edge of the light. It had never come close, but Nathan swore the cat watched them like it understood. "Animals know more than we think, Dad," he'd said. "Some of them just carry stories." Henry had forgotten that conversation until now. Laura adjusted her scanner, the one she kept for tracking tagged wildlife. The small device beeped when she passed it over Echo's shoulder. Numbers appeared on the screen, a microchip ID linked to a national database. She frowned. "This is unusual. Rehabilitation units don't normally microchip bobcats unless they've been part of a special program." She didn't say it out loud, but Henry knew special program usually meant funding research or cooperation with agencies most people never dealt with. As she copied the ID into her notebook, Henry kept his eyes on the bobcat. Echo sat on the snow, breathing slow, not making a move to leave. That in itself was strange. Wildcats don't linger near people once they're free. Laura called a contact at the state wildlife office, her voice low. Henry caught phrases: interagency transfer, military liaison, classified training, none of which made sense in the context of a bobcat. When she hung up, she looked at Henry for a long time before speaking. "They won't tell me much. But this collar means Echo has been through human contact before, possibly even specific behavioral training." Henry shook his head. "Training for a bobcat." Laura gave a half shrug. "We've seen unusual cases. Falcons fitted with cameras, seals trained to detect mines. Sometimes it's research, sometimes it's something else." It reminded Henry of a real-life case he'd read about years ago. Dolphin trained by the Navy to detect underwater mines in the Persian Gulf. People had scoffed at first, but the program had saved divers' lives. If they could train marine mammals for military use, maybe it wasn't so far-fetched to think a wild cat could be conditioned for certain tasks. The thought didn't make him uneasy. It made him curious. Why would Nathan have known about a bobcat named Echo? And how did that same animal end up tangled in fishing line in the Yellowstone? He could have dismissed it as coincidence, but he'd lived long enough to know better. Coincidence was a word people used when they didn't want to dig deeper. Echo shifted his weight, stood and limped toward Henry. The cat stopped a few feet away, eyes steady as if measuring something unseen. Henry stayed still, letting the moment stretch. The air between them felt charged, not in a threatening way, but in the way a closed door feels just before someone turns the key. Laura broke the silence. If this cat's part of a federal rehabilitation or training program, someone will come looking. The question is, do we tell them right away? Henry didn't answer. He thought of all the times in the ranger service when he'd had to decide between following protocol and following his gut. The rule book was clean and tidy. The gut was messy. But the gut usually knew. A small lesson came back to him from those years. The first thing you find isn't always the most important clue. It's the second, third, or fourth layer that tells you what's really going on. The collar was layer 1. He had a feeling the next layers were going to be harder to face. Laura suggested moving Echo to her enclosed transport cage for observation. Henry nodded but stayed close, helping guide the bobcat without touching. Echo stepped in without resistance. That alone was another clue. True wild bobcats don't walk into confined spaces without a fight. As they secured the cage in the back of Laura's truck, Henry's mind worked through possibilities. If Echo had been part of Nathan's world somehow, then maybe this wasn't just a rescue. Maybe it was a handoff, the kind of silent passing of responsibility that doesn't need a signature. A fresh perspective edged in. Sometimes the answers we're looking for don't come in words or documents. Sometimes they arrive on 4 legs, wearing a collar with a name that already belongs to our memory. On the drive back to her facility, Laura filled the silence with facts. How bobcats adapt to human proximity, how rehabilitation protocols work, how long it takes for an animal to readjust to the wild. Henry listened, but his thoughts were elsewhere. When they reached the facility, he helped unload the cage and set it in the examination room. Echo settled inside, eyes never leaving Henry. Laura began her checks, pulse, injury, inspection, hydration. Henry stood at the edge of the room, hands in his pockets, feeling like he was standing in a moment that had been waiting for him long before today. He thought again of Nathan's words. One day you'll see what I mean. It was possible that day had just arrived. The more Henry looked at the collar, the more certain he became Echo's story was tied to his own. And that certainty deepened when someone else learned about the rescue, someone with very different intentions. The next morning, Henry was back at Laura's small wildlife center. The air inside smelled faintly of pine shavings and the herbal salve she used for treating wounds. Echo was in a larger enclosure now, moving carefully on the injured leg, but with more alertness in his eyes. Henry crouched near the wire, speaking softly. "You're looking better, kid." The bobcat's ears twitched toward him. Laura entered with her tablet, scrolling through notes. "I've been digging. The microchip records are unusual." She angled the screen so Henry could see. The file wasn't like the typical rehab profiles. No release date, no documented origin from local rescues. Instead, there were references to Interagency Wildlife Behavioral Initiative and a contact number tied to a federal office in Washington. "I called the number," she said. They confirmed Echo's part of a joint program between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a military research unit. They wouldn't tell me more without authorization, but they asked a lot of questions about you. Henry leaned back on his heels. "About me, yes. Who found him? How you handled the rescue? Whether you have prior experience with trained animals?" She hesitated before adding, "Henry, they know Nathan's service record." The words landed heavy. Nathan's name had no reason to be in that conversation unless there was a link. And that meant this wasn't just a stray bobcat with a strange collar. Henry thought of a real-life case he'd once read about in a ranger bulletin, a rehabilitated golden eagle that had been part of a border surveillance project. The bird had been released into the wild, but months later it turned up injured hundreds of miles from its last known location. Its handler recognized it immediately. That reunion had sparked questions about how much animals remember and who they remember. The idea that Echo could have been in Nathan's orbit didn't feel far-fetched anymore. It felt likely. Before Henry could say more, the front door swung open. The sound of boots on tile carried down the hall, followed by a voice he recognized and disliked instantly. "Well, this is where you've been hiding the prize." Raymond Steele stepped into the room, coat draped over his shoulders like a cape. The local developer's smile was thin, the kind you saw before someone told you what they really wanted. Henry stood. "What do you want, Steele?" "Just concern for the safety of our town," Steele said, glancing at Echo. Wild animals that have been trained for whatever this one's been trained for can be unpredictable. You know that. Laura's jaw tightened. Raymond, this animal is under veterinary care. He's not a threat. That's your opinion. Mine is that a dangerous bobcat doesn't belong near residential property, especially not on the land of a man with known health issues. Steele let the words hang as if the implication needed no clarification. Henry's hands curled into fists in his pockets. He knew what Steele was doing. This was the same tactic he'd used on other landowners, sow fear, then offer a solution in the form of a buyout. The small lesson Henry had learned years ago in the Ranger Service came back to him. People who talk about protecting you often mean protecting their own interests. Steele took a step closer to the enclosure. Tell you what, Henry, I'll make a generous offer for your property, more than it's worth, and I'll see to it that this creature is taken to a secure facility, no cost to you. Henry didn't move. Echo stays where he is. The smile vanished from Steele's face. Think it over. The council might see it differently, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of that vote. He turned and left boots clicking down the hall. Laura exhaled slowly. He's not going to let this go. Henry looked back at Echo, who had settled into a crouch, watching the door Steele had gone through. There was no fear in the animal's eyes, just awareness. A fresh perspective began to form. This wasn't just about Echo's safety. It was about everything Nathan had stood for, standing your ground, when someone tries to take what matters under the guise of help. Laura broke the silence. There's more. I spoke to an old colleague who worked with military canine units. She said there were whispers of an experimental branch of the Veteran Support Program, one that paired certain rescued wildlife with soldiers for rehabilitation purposes. The theory was that the unpredictability of a wild animal could help retrain a veteran's senses, build trust, and restore confidence. Echo's behavioral profile matches that work. Henry thought about Nathan's passion for connecting people with animals. It fit too well to ignore. If Nathan had been involved in getting Echo into that program, then this wasn't a random encounter. This was the unfinished promise walking back into his life. Real-life examples of this kind of work were rare, but powerful. Henry remembered a documentary about wolves helping trauma survivors rebuild social awareness and boundaries. The science was still emerging, but the emotional impact was undeniable. He felt it now, standing a few feet from Echo. The animal wasn't domesticated. He wasn't a pet. But there was an understanding in the way he held Henry's gaze, like two sentinels acknowledging each other. Laura touched his arm. We should prepare for pushback. Steele will try to use the council to get Echo removed. If the federal program claims him, we might not have a choice. Henry nodded slowly. Then we make our choice now. Echo stays, whatever it takes. Henry didn't know then how quickly whatever it takes would be tested. Within days, Steele would make his move, and it would push both man and bobcat into a fight neither had planned for, but both were born to face. 2 days after Steele's visit, Henry was patching a section of fence along the back pasture when the tightness started in his chest. It wasn't new. He'd been living with a faulty heart for years, but this time the weight was heavier, the air harder to pull in. He leaned on the fence post, willing the dizziness to pass. It didn't. The hammer slipped from his hand and landed in the snow. The last thing he remembered was Echo's sharp yowl from the porch. When he woke, fluorescent lights glared overhead. A nurse was adjusting a monitor beside his bed. "You're at Livingston Memorial, Mr. Collins. You had a cardiac episode." He tried to sit up, but the wires and his weakness kept him down. Laura was at the foot of the bed, relief in her eyes. Echo wouldn't stop pacing and making noise. "When I came by, you were on the ground. We got you here just in time." Henry closed his eyes. The thought of the bobcat back at the cabin without him made his chest ache differently. Who's looking after him? Laura hesitated. "That's complicated." Steele's already talking to animal control, saying you're not fit to care for a trained wild animal. He's pushing for immediate removal. It was the kind of move Henry had feared. Steele knew timing was everything. Hit someone when they're weakest and the rest comes easy. He'd seen the same strategy play out in the ranger service when out-of-town buyers pressured old ranchers to sell during bad winters. The hospital room felt smaller. Henry thought of a lesson he'd learned long ago: when someone comes for what matters to you, your absence speaks louder than your presence. And right now he was absent. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, something unexpected was happening. Echo had refused to stay at Laura's facility. He'd slipped out of his temporary pen and followed her truck to town, stopping short only when he reached the hospital parking lot. No coaxing would get him to leave. By the second day, word had spread. Locals stopped to see the hospital bobcat, some bringing meat scraps or warm blankets. Veterans from the American Legion post drove in from nearby towns, saying Echo reminded them of service dogs they'd served alongside. A few carried their quiet grief, standing in the cold, just to be near the animal who refused to leave his person's side. Henry didn't know any of this until Laura brought in her phone and showed him the photos. There was Echo crouched under the overhang near the ER doors, his breath clouding in the winter air, eyes fixed on the sliding glass entrance as if willing Henry to walk through it. Real-life examples of this kind of loyalty are rare, but they happen. A military working dog waiting by his handler's casket, a cat traveling hundreds of miles to return to its family. Each story carries the same truth. Bonds forged in trust don't break just because the circumstances change. Lying in that bed, Henry realized Echo's vigil wasn't just about him. People were gathering because they recognized the shape of that loyalty. It was something they wanted to believe still existed in a world that often felt careless. The hospital staff noticed too. Nurses began taking shifts to bring Echo fresh water. An orderly set out a heat lamp. Even the security guard, whose job it was to keep animals off the property, started bringing leftovers from his dinner. A fresh perspective began to take shape for Henry. He'd thought of Echo as the one needing rescue. Now it seemed the rescue was mutual, each giving the other a reason to hold on. On the fourth day, Laura returned with news. The council's meeting tonight. Steele's making his case to remove Echo permanently. He's saying it's for public safety. Henry's pulse quickened. Public safety, he muttered. And who's protecting him from people like Steele? Laura took his hand. I can speak for you, but it would help if the town saw you even for a few minutes. That night, with the doctor's reluctant permission, Henry was wheeled to the front entrance. The cold bit into his cheeks, but the sight waiting for him pushed everything else away. Echo was there, rising to his feet as soon as Henry appeared, tail flicking once before he padded forward. They met halfway, man and bobcat, the crowd parting to let them through. No one spoke. Henry knelt as far as his body would allow and rested a hand on the cold ground between them. Echo lowered his head, eyes closing for a long blink. The connection was wordless but clear. The small lesson was one Henry had been circling for years without naming it. Sometimes your worth isn't measured by what you can still do, but by who still shows up for you when you can't do anything at all. The next morning, Steele's push failed. Enough townsfolk had shown up to the meeting to speak about what they'd seen in the parking lot. Not a dangerous animal, but a guardian. The council voted to leave Echo in Henry's care until further review. Henry returned to his hospital bed, exhausted but lighter. He knew this reprieve wouldn't end the fight, but it had bought them time. And time, he thought, is all you need if you know what to do with it. That time would prove short. Before Henry could leave the hospital, Echo would lead Laura to something buried deep under snow. And roots, something Nathan had hidden years before, waiting for the day it would be needed. The snow in Paradise Valley had crusted over after a week of bitter cold, turning the ground into a frozen sheet that cracked under each step. Laura pulled her collar up against the wind as she followed Echo's steady trot away from the hospital parking lot. She'd meant to lead him back to the facility, but he had other plans, moving with purpose, glancing back just often enough to make sure she kept up. Henry had insisted she see where he's going before the weather worsened. If he's heading home, let him, Henry had said over the phone, his voice rough but certain. And if he's not, pay attention. He doesn't waste his steps. They left the main road and cut across the pasture toward the Collins property. Echo didn't hesitate, weaving between drifts, crossing the frozen creek, climbing the rise behind the barn. He stopped at the base of an old cottonwood paws, already scraping at the snow. Laura recognized the tree. It had been Nathan's favorite spot to watch summer storms roll in. She dropped to her knees beside the bobcat, brushing away snow until her fingers hit something hard. A corner of a weathered case, peeked out military issue with a locking mechanism that looked far from ordinary. By the time Henry arrived 2 days later, released from the hospital with orders to take it easy. The case was sitting on the kitchen table. His hands hovered over it, the way a man might approach a letter from someone long gone. "That's Nathan's gear," he said quietly. "I'd know it anywhere." The lock required both a biometric scan and a voice code. Laura read the instructions aloud, doubtful. Fingerprint and phrase. That's unusual for a storage case. Henry placed his thumb on the pad. "Nothing." Laura frowned. "It needs the voice code, too. Try saying something Nathan might have programmed." Henry took a breath. "Collins and Son. Always forward." A click sounded inside and the lid eased open. Inside, sealed in waterproof sleeves, were documents, a flash drive, and an envelope marked Dad. The first page of the document stopped Henry cold. A life insurance policy in his name, more than enough to pay off the property, cover medical costs, and fund something called the Nathan Collins Foundation for Veteran Wildlife Rehabilitation. He read Nathan's letter next. The handwriting was steady, the tone direct. "Dad, if you're reading this, Echo found you. He's part of my last mission to make sure you keep living and keep helping others. The foundation is ready to launch as soon as you sign the papers. Echo's training is designed for veterans, but he chose you first." Henry read the last line twice. "Trust him. He knows the way home, even when you don't." For a long moment, he just sat there, the sound of the wind rattling the window. Then he slid the flash drive into his old laptop. Nathan's face appeared on the screen, speaking from some dusty outpost halfway across the world. He explained the program, the idea of pairing rescued wild animals with veterans for therapeutic work. "It's about respect," Nathan said. "If you can build trust with a bobcat, you can rebuild trust with yourself." Henry thought of a real-life example from his ranger years, a veteran who'd spent a summer volunteering at the park working with injured raptors. The man had arrived withdrawn, barely speaking. By the end of the season, he was leading tours, explaining each bird's story. "They're not broken," he'd said to Henry once. "They're just waiting for the right place to land." The small lesson was clear. Sometimes, the bridge back to yourself is built by caring for something else, especially something that doesn't speak your language, but understands your intent. Laura leaned over the table. "Henry, this isn't just a gift. It's a plan Nathan built for you to carry out, but Steele won't let this go. If he finds out about the funding, he'll look for another way to force you out." Henry nodded slowly. "Then we make it public. We launch the foundation now while the town's still paying attention to Echo." It was a fresh perspective for him, shifting from defense to offense. All these months, he'd been bracing for loss. Now, for the first time, he was thinking about building something. They spent the next 2 days contacting the people Nathan had listed as trustees. Old military buddies. A lawyer in Bozeman, a retired wildlife vet in Wyoming. The responses were immediate and supportive. "If Nate set this up, I'm in," one man said over the phone. He talked about it every chance he got. By the end of the week, they had the legal groundwork in place. The foundation's mission was simple but powerful. Provide veterans with hands-on rehabilitation work alongside rescued wildlife, not just to heal the animals, but to heal the people too. Henry looked over the final papers before signing. "Nathan's right," he said to Laura. "Echo's training isn't an accident. He was meant to be here." When the pen left the page, Henry felt a shift inside. This wasn't just honoring Nathan's memory. It was answering the promise he'd left unfinished. The ink was barely dry when word reached Steele. And the next move he made would push Henry, Laura, and Echo into the kind of confrontation where every choice carried a cost, and every cost revealed what you were truly willing to fight for. The launch of the Nathan Collins Foundation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in the front yard of the Collins property, under a winter sky that couldn't decide between snow and sun. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with ranchers, students, and townsfolk. Some had driven hours. A few came with their own animals, rescue dogs, therapy horses, even one woman with a red-tailed hawk perched calmly on her glove. Henry moved slowly but steadily through the crowd, Echo at his side. The bobcat wasn't on a leash. He didn't need one. Every so often, Echo would pause, lock eyes with someone, and hold that gaze until they smiled or exhaled, as if he'd just reminded them of something they'd forgotten. When Henry stepped up to the small wooden podium, there was no grand speech prepared. Just a letter from Nathan laminated now that he read aloud. The words were simple, about service, trust, and the belief that healing isn't a one-way street. "If you're here today," Nathan had written, "it's because you believe the same thing I do, that the wild still has a place in our lives, and that we still have a place in each other's." The applause was quiet at first, then grew the kind of sound that carries warmth in cold air. After the formalities, the real work began. The Foundation's first project was pairing local veterans with rescue animals, not just dogs, but foxes, hawks, and yes, bobcats when possible. The goal wasn't to tame them. It was to meet them where they were and find a rhythm together. Henry took the first team himself, a young Marine named Kyle, recently home and struggling to re-enter civilian life, and a skittish red fox named Juniper. Watching Kyle learn to move slowly to let the animal come to him reminded Henry of his first days with Echo. Real-life examples of the transformation came quickly. Within weeks, one veteran who'd barely spoken above a whisper was laughing as he told the story of a great horned owl stealing his glove. Another, who hadn't been able to sleep through the night in years, found rest with a retired service dog curled against his bed. Henry kept a small notebook in his pocket, jotting down what he called field notes. One entry read, "It's not about fixing them. It's about showing them they're not alone." That was the small lesson the Foundation reinforced again and again. Rescue is not a one-sided act. Every time you step in to help, whether it's an animal in icy water or a neighbor in a bad season, you're also giving yourself a reason to stand up tomorrow. Echo's role evolved naturally. He became the Foundation's ambassador, not through tricks or training demonstrations, but simply by being present. Kids visiting on school trips would whisper "wildcat" in awe. Parents would ask questions about bobcats in the wild, and veterans would find themselves talking more freely when Echo settled nearby. The knowledge Henry shared wasn't just about animals. He taught about patience, about how to read small cues, the flick of an ear, the shift of weight, and how those skills applied just as much to people. "Most of us broadcast what we need," he'd say, "we just don't all use words to do it." One afternoon, a local reporter asked him what the biggest change in his life had been since the rescue. Henry didn't hesitate. "Before Echo, I was waiting to run out of days. Now I'm making sure they count." It was a fresh perspective he wished he'd had years earlier. You don't have to feel ready to begin again. You just have to begin, and the readiness grows from there. Months passed. The property felt alive again, not just with the movement of animals, but with conversation, with shared meals, with the laughter of people who'd been quiet too long. The mortgage was paid, the hospital bills were cleared. Steele, facing his own legal troubles after an investigation into his business practices, no longer darkened Henry's door. One spring morning, Henry walked out to the cottonwood where Echo had first uncovered Nathan's case. The snow was gone, replaced by new grass. Echo paced nearby, tail flicking lazily. "You did good, kid," Henry said. The bobcat blinked slowly, then turned toward the path back home. That day, a group of veterans gathered in the barn for a workshop. Henry spoke about the importance of meeting the animals as they were not as you wished them to be. "The same goes for people," he added. "And for yourself. Healing's not about getting back to who you were. It's about learning who you are now and making peace with it." The barn was quiet for a moment. Then Kyle the Marine, paired with Juniper, nodded. "Guess that means we're all rescues, huh?" Henry smiled. Exactly. The story of a man saving a drowning bobcat in a freezing river had traveled far beyond Paradise Valley by then. Videos of Echo at the hospital, of the Foundation's work, and of veterans walking alongside wild animals had been shared thousands of times. Messages came in from across the country, from people who'd lost spouses, from those battling illness, from folks who'd never seen a bobcat except on a screen but felt like they knew Echo now. Each message was a reminder that connection doesn't need proximity. It needs sincerity. For Henry, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition. It was the quiet moments, a veteran pausing mid-task to scratch a fox's chin, a child learning the difference between a bobcat and a lynx, Echo resting at his feet after a long day. Those moments said more than any speech could. And so the Foundation grew not as a monument to loss, but as a living, breathing commitment to turning that loss into something that served life. Nathan's vision had taken root, and Henry had found his way back to purpose with Echo still at his side. The lesson in all of it was simple, though not easy. Your second chapter might not look like your first, and that's okay. Sometimes it's better. Sometimes the thing you think you're saving is saving you. Now, as you sit here listening to this story, I want you to take a moment and think about your own life. Who or what has shown up for you when you needed it most? Have you ever been someone else's rescue even without knowing it? And maybe the bigger question, what could you do starting today to be that for someone else, person or animal? If this story touched you, if Echo's journey and Henry's promise sparked something in you, then help us keep sharing it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And maybe, after you click away, take one small step toward your unfinished promise. You never know who or what might be waiting for you to show up.